Okay, here we go. Here's this book again. I wanted to make a quick disclaimer at the beginning here. I'm not going to say that this book is dog shit, but reading it makes me feel like somebody's holding my head underwater, and then once in a while, I will get a breath. I'll get my head above the water, and I'll actually understand like a passage or a couple of passages. But overall, I think a lot of what I'm reading is kind of lost on me. Like, I understand the words, but just the subjects. I'm not an economist. I don't know very much about government. But I'm going to continue to push through because, like I said, there are those moments where I do kind of understand what it is that the authors are talking about. So there's my disclaimer. And now I'm going to return to Democracy for Realists: Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government by Achen and Bartels. And the chapter that we are on is Chapter 2, The Elusive Mandate, Elections in the Mirage of Popular Control. And the portion that I'm going to read today is called The Illusion of Issue Voting. The spatial theory of voting cast issue proximity as both the primary determinant of voters' choices and the primary focus of candidates' campaign strategies. Over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, this theoretical development was gradually but powerfully translated into empirical analyses of voting behavior. In the authoritative American National Election Studies conducted by the University of Michigan, questions regarding issues of public policy were increasingly recast as 7-point issue scales, directly inspired by spatial theory. Survey respondents were invited to place themselves, candidates, and parties on each issue dimension. The proliferation of issue scales provided ample raw material for naive statistical analyses relating vote choices to issue proximities, calculated by comparing respondents' own positions on these issue scales with the positions they attributed to the competing candidates or parties. Now, reader's note, I didn't understand a lot of what I just read. But maybe some of you do, and maybe just reading the words somehow will help me to understand it better later on in the book. So I just wanted to say that. But we'll get to a part where we'll all understand what it's saying, I promise. The casual ambiguity inherent in statistical analyses of this sort was clear to scholars of voting behavior by the early 1970s. Richard Brody and Benjamin Page outlined 3 distinct interpretations of the positive correlation between issue proximities and vote choices. The first, policy-oriented evaluation, corresponds to the conventional interpretation of issue voting in the folk theory of democracy. Prospective voters observe the candidates' policy positions, compare them to their own policy preferences, and choose a candidate accordingly. The second, persuasion, involves prospective voters altering their own issue positions to bring them into conformity with the issue positions of the candidate or party they favor. The third, projection, involves prospective voters convincing themselves that the candidate or party they favor has issue positions similar to their own, and perhaps also that disfavored candidates or parties have dissimilar issue positions, whether or not this is in fact the case. In both the second and third cases, issue proximity is a consequence of the voter's preference for a specific candidate or party, not a cause of that preference. Reader's note, I understood most of that part, so this is the reason I'm reading this book. Now, no more reader's notes. Let's plow through this. Brodie and Page wrote, we need some means for examining the potential for persuasion and for projection and of estimating them as separate processes. If the estimation of policy voting is important to the understanding of the role of the citizen in a democracy, and theorists of democracy certainly write as if it is, then any procedure which fails to control for projection and persuasion will be an undependable base upon which to build our understanding. Brodie and Page's clear warning was followed by some resourceful attempts to resolve the casual ambiguity they identified. Unfortunately, those attempts mostly served to underline the extent to which the conclusions drawn from such analyses rested on fragile and apparently untestable statistical assumptions. Perhaps most dramatically, back-to-back articles by Marcus and Converse in the same issue of the American Political Science Review estimated complex simultaneous equation models relating partisanship, issue proximity, and assessments of candidates' personalities using the same data from the American National Election Studies surveys, but came to very different conclusions about the basis of voting behavior. If two teams of highly competent analysts asking essentially similar questions of the same data could come to such different conclusions, it seemed clear that the results of such exercises must depend at least as much on the analysts' theoretical preconceptions and associated statistical assumptions as on the behavior of voters. In light of this apparent impasse, many scholars of voting behavior have preferred to sidestep the casual ambiguity plaguing the relationship between issue positions and votes by reverting to simple, single equation models in which issue positions can affect vote choices but not vice versa. In effect, they have relied on the assumptions of the folk theory of democracy rather than empirical evidence to resolve the problem raised by Brodie and Page. For example, Stephen Ansolabeher, I hope I pronounced that right, Jonathan Rodden, and James Snyder cumulated responses to dozens of specific issue questions in American National Election Study surveys into just two broad, economic and moral, issue positions, discarding all of the remaining variation in specific issue responses as attributable to measurement error. They imputed issue positions for voters who had none or simply dropped them from the analysis. They then imposed a model in which the observed relationship between issue positions and vote choices, net of partisanship and ideology, was attributed entirely to issue voting, with no allowance for persuasion or group identity effects. Unsurprisingly, they reported finding stable policy preferences and strong evidence of issue voting. Subsequent work by Gabriel Lenz provided substantial additional grounds for skepticism regarding inferences of this sort. Lenz used repeated interviews with the same individuals to show that persuasion plays a large role and policy-oriented evaluation remarkably little role in accounting for observed associations between issue positions and votes. That is, candidate choices determine issue positions, not vice versa. In the 2000 presidential campaign, for example, candidate George W. Bush advocated allowing individual citizens to invest Social Security funds in the stock market, thereby catapulting a previously obscure policy proposal into the political limelight. Much of the news coverage and advertising in the final month of the campaign focused on the candidates' contrasting stands on the issue. In a typical battleground media market, the two candidates together ran about 200 ads touching on Social Security privatization just in the final week before Election Day. And sure enough, the statistical relationship between voters' views on Social Security privatization and their preferences for Bush or Al Gore, holding constant party identification, more than doubled over the course of the campaign. This is exactly the sort of shift we might expect if voters were attending to the political debate, weighing the competing candidates' policy platforms, and formulating their vote intentions accordingly. However, Lenz's more detailed analysis, employing repeated interviews with the same people, demonstrated that this substantial increase in the apparent electoral impact of views about Social Security privatization was almost entirely illusory, due not to changes in vote intentions, but to Bush and Gore supporters learning their preferred candidate's position on the issue and then adopting it as their own. As Lenz put it, the increase in media and campaign attention to the issue did almost nothing to make people whose position was the same as Bush's more likely to vote for Bush than they already were. On issue after issue, ranging from support for public works in 1976 and defense spending in 1980, to European integration in Britain, to nuclear power in the Netherlands in the wake of the Chernobyl reactor meltdown, Lenz's analyses provided substantial evidence of vote-driven changes in issue positions, but little or no evidence of issue-driven changes in candidate or party preferences. As John Zoller put it, partisan voters take the positions they are expected as partisans to take, but do not seem to care about them. Lenz characterized these findings as disappointing for scholars who see democracy as fundamentally about voters expressing their views on policy, noting that the inverted relationship between issue positions and votes seemed to leave politicians with considerable freedom in the policies they choose. The next section is entitled Elections and Public Policy. Almost all of the scholarly evidence we have considered thus far regarding public opinion and electoral behavior focuses on the attitudes and votes of individual citizens. Fortunately, we are not limited to individual-level analyses of public opinion and voting behavior. We can also attempt to assess directly how elections shape democratic politics. Does issue voting compel both parties to adopt policy positions close to those of the median voter, as the spatial theory of elections implies? As we have seen, U.S. presidential elections in the post-World War II era, and especially the landslide defeats suffered by Barry Goldwater in 1964 and George McGovern in 1972, seem to comport rather well with the predictions of the spatial theory. However, more systematic research on U.S. presidential elections has suggested that Goldwater and McGovern's losses had less to do with their issue positions than with election year economic conditions. Ideological extremism probably cost them just a few percentage points of the popular vote. More generally, the impact of candidates' policy stands on election outcomes, at least over the range of policy stands observed in modern presidential elections, seems to be quite modest. As Zoller put it, the penalty for extremism, if real, is not large. The broad analysis of U.S. public policy in Robert Erickson, Michael McCowan, and James Stimson's The Macro Polity similarly underlines the failure of issue voting to discipline politicians in the manner suggested by the spatial theory of elections. Erickson, McCowan, and Stimson measured the ideological tenor of policy activity in each branch of Congress and the White House over more than 40 years. They found that policy outcomes shifted substantially when partisan control shifted from Democrats to Republicans or from Republicans to Democrats. The public's policy mood also influenced policy regardless of which party was in control, but that effect was small by comparison. For example, the estimated impact on White House policy activity of moving from the most conservative policy mood recorded in 4 decades to the most liberal policy mood was only about 1/3 as large as the estimated impact of replacing a typical Republican president with a typical Democrat. The estimated effects of partisan control on congressional policy activity were even larger. The implication is that citizens affect public policy, insofar as they affect it at all, almost entirely by voting out one partisan team and replacing it with another. If the election of a Republican or Democrat president itself provided a reliable signal of the public's policy mood, the resulting swing to right or left in policy outcomes might be characterized as a reflection of majority rule. though not in the sense suggested by the median voter theorem. The authors of The Macro Polity argued that presidential election outcomes are strongly affected by the public's policy mood. However, their statistical analyses required delicate controls for the prevailing balance of partisan loyalties in the electorate and the inferred ideological positions of the competing candidates. Subsequent analyses have found the apparent impact of policy mood evaporating once election year economic conditions are taken into account. Meanwhile, scholars attempting to forecast presidential election outcomes have generally been content to ignore policy mood, issue preferences, and ideology, a telling indication that these factors are of relatively little importance in determining who wins. Studies of Congress likewise find that the policy preferences of citizens in a given state or district are only modestly predictive of election outcomes, and that Democrats and Republicans routinely take very different stands once they are elected, even when they represent states or districts with very similar political views. Both of these points are clear in Figure 2.1. I could describe it. It's representatives, conservatism. Republicans is really high, Democrats is really low. Constituents, conservatism. They are clustered around their lines. So. Which relates the overall roll call voting record of each member of the House of Representatives in the 112th Congress to the policy preferences of his or her constituents. District preferences are measured using a 12-item scale including liberal conservative self-identification, beliefs about climate change and support for the Affordable Care Act, domestic spending, the Iraq War, gays in the military, gun control, affirmative action, environmental protection, defense spending, a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants, and abortion. The scale runs from 0, most liberal, to 100, most conservative. But the range of district averages is much narrower, from 2.45 to 5.9. The most liberal congressional districts in the country, at the far left of Figure 2.1, invariably elected Democrats to the House in 2010. These were overwhelmingly urban and mostly majority-minority districts. At the opposite extreme, the most conservative districts almost all elected Republicans. However, for districts in the broad middle of the political spectrum, election outcomes were a rather unreliable reflection of citizens' policy preferences. Moderately liberal districts, in the second quartile of the national distribution, elected Republicans 46% of the time, while moderately conservative districts, in the third quartile, elected Democrats only 25% of the time. The modest correlation between constituents' preferences and election outcomes implies substantial variation in representation, given the gulf in roll call voting behavior between Republicans and Democrats representing similar districts in Figure 2.1. Nor is it the case that representatives won election in what looked like uncongenial districts by catering closely to citizens' preferences at the expense of their own or their party's convictions. The dotted lines in Figure 2.1 summarize the separate linear relationships between the conservatism of each party's representatives and their constituents' preferences. Within each party, there is a modest positive relationship between constituents' preferences and House members' roll call votes. However, the magnitudes of those relationships are dwarfed by the distance between the two lines, which represents the expected difference in conservatism between Republican and Democratic members representing districts with identical public opinion. Clearly, Republican and Democratic members of Congress representing constituents with similar preferences behaved in very different ways. Whether these differences were produced by differences in the representatives' personal ideological convictions or party pressures or other factors is, for our purposes here, irrelevant. The key point is that representatives' voting behavior was not strongly constrained by their constituents' views. Elections do not force successful candidates to reflect the policy preferences of the median voter, as Downesian logic implies. The pattern of partisan polarization evident in Figure 2.1 is not a fluke attributable to a particular congressional session or opinion survey. Indeed, a historical analysis of every Congress going back to the 1870s, using presidential election returns as proxies for constituents' preferences, suggests that similar differences in expected roll call voting patterns between Republicans and Democrats representing similar constituencies have been fairly common in the past 140 years. Bartels, Clinton, and Gear are forthcoming. Scholars of comparative politics sometimes argue that the pattern of alternating partisan extremism that has characterized the American political system through much of its history is absent or attenuated in multi-party systems where legislative seats are allocated through proportional representation. According to G. Bingham Powell, for example, proportional systems are more successful in getting governments, and even more so the influential policymakers, close to the median citizen. However, assessments of this sort depend on untested assumptions about how parties' positions get translated into policies under different institutional arrangements. More direct assessments of patterns of responsiveness have found little consistent difference between proportional and majoritarian systems in their extent of correspondence between median voters' preferences and actual policy outcomes. Perhaps some other institutional arrangement would work better. We do not know. But at present, there is little evidence to suggest that changes in electoral institutions will be sufficient to ensure popular control of public policy through electoral competition. Conclusion. The folk theory of electoral democracy, the notion that elections can reveal the will or the preferences of a majority on a set of issues, as Dahl put it, has played a central role in both political science and popular thinking about politics. Scholars have elegantly codified the populist ideal in the spatial theory of elections. The behavior it enshrines as normative, issue voting, is widely regarded as a hallmark of good citizenship. Indeed, a conscientious voter nowadays can choose among a variety of websites, inviting her to answer a series of policy questions and be told which candidates to support, apparently on the assumption that nothing other than the candidate's policy positions, and just these policy positions, should matter to her. The social science theorizing and the cultural norm are both derived directly from the folk theory of democracy. Unfortunately, as we have seen, this populist ideal in both its scientific and popular incarnations suffers from grave logical and practical problems. Both the remarkable theoretical insights of Arrow and his successors and the seminal empirical research of Converse, and many others, punched significant holes in the romantic populist notion of democracy. Although a great deal of subsequent scholarly effort has been devoted to recasting, circumscribing, or rejecting their claims, repeated attempts to sidestep the theoretical and empirical deficiencies of the populist ideal have failed, leaving the strong challenge to democratic hopes posed by modern social science fundamentally intact. These scientific findings have had little effect on practical politics. Joseph Schumpeter argued, perhaps wishfully, that today it is difficult to find any student of social processes who has a good word for the simplistic notions of the folk theory. Nevertheless, he added, action continued to be taken on that theory all the time it was being blown to pieces. The more untenable it was being proved to be, the more completely it dominated official phraseology and the rhetoric of the politician. More than 7 additional decades of demolition work have done little to alter that picture. Indeed, periodic frustration with the apparent failure of elections to faithfully translate the will of the people into public policy has prompted repeated attempts to wrench American political practice into closer accordance with the folk theory. The principal goal of these efforts has been to constrain or even bypass those whom the reformers blamed for their disappointments, professional politicians. Perhaps most radically, reformers in the progressive era attempted to restore the absolute sovereignty of the people by circumventing the traditional electoral processes altogether, instituting direct democracy via initiatives and referendums. We turn next to the promise and pitfalls of these repeated attempts to impose an idealistic theory on the recalcitrant reality of American democracy. It's the end of the chapter. The next chapter is called Chapter 3, Tumbling Down into a Democratical Republic, Pure Democracy, and the Pitfalls of Popular Control. And that one I will start someday soon. All right. Bye.